Hello and welcome to another episode of the Liz Career Coaching Podcast. My name is Liz Herrera and I am your host. Today we're diving into the world of improvisation with Alex Beard. Alex is the founder of Beard Collaborative, is a graduate of Virginia Tech, where he studied theater arts and leadership and social change, specializing in public dialogue, design thinking methodologies, applied improvisation, and utilizing the arts as tools for social change. He has built over 15 years of professional experience as an actor, director, teaching artist, and facilitator. Alex has propelled creativity and innovation to the forefront of the way we work and problem solve, leaving an indelible mark on numerous organizations around the country. It is a pleasure to have you on my show today, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Liz. This is exciting.
It is. I have to say that I connected with you at the National Association of Colleges and Employers conference this summer.
Yeah.
And I have to share that I'm going to say it, your session was my favorite.
Oh, I love to hear it. There were so many great sessions too, so thank you. Kudos.
Hundreds.
That's awesome.
I'm an introvert. I lean more towards introversion, and it was intimidating because there were so many people, and you walked us through so many improvisation activities, and you just kept us so engaged. And I have used some of your techniques in my career course, just so you
I
know.
love that. I love to hear that. That's great. Yeah, it's one of those things where I try to approach it from a realm that's a little different than other folks. I like to really we take little baby steps as we go through and do some of this work rather than going off the deep end and feeling like you're being put on the spot, because that's really not what improv is in my mind. There's a really focused and practical way of going about and exposing people to this great work.
No, absolutely. And you have such a extensive career journey, and I just love the way that you approach the work that you do. So I would love to get started, to kind of hear how how you've used creativity to for social change. Can you share a
Yeah.
little bit of your journey and what sparked that interest to blend creativity and community engagement?
Absolutely. So I like to describe myself as a lifelong public servant. I am someone who actively, over the course of my career, has gone in and found ways that I can be sort of a service of change for folks. Coming in, bringing in new creative ideas, questioning the status quo in a good way that allows for positive growth in an organization and for communities at large. And so my background, I studied theater arts and leadership social change at Virginia Tech, as you mentioned. And the program there is very interesting. They have a public dialogue master's program, and I really just latched on to a lot of that work that was happening when I was an undergrad. And so they actively are working with individuals in the Appalachian community, individuals who are disenfranchised, and figuring out ways to imbue and inflect the arts within their particular communities. So that way it creates a platform in which that individual can be more engaging and ultimately connect with individuals on like a larger and deeper realm. So what I would say is, really ultimately the key sort of approach for like what I do and sort of how I've approached it throughout my career is really diving in and figuring out, okay, I know I have this creative component. Everyone's trying to do this sort of business element. We have projects, we have things that we have to manage, but what do we do to take it beyond that? And so I started at a nonprofit management association company. It was great work. I learned a lot about conference management for very, very large conferences. I was able to apply some of that project management skill work that I had built when I was in college, but it wasn't really what I was looking for. What I was looking for was that community development approach. And so I ended up working for municipal government. And there I was able to take some of this creativity and build creative programs for the community at large. So everything from preschool to senior age programs. And I had a niche sort of expertise for really engaging with our high school and college age demographic. And so I built programs that were looking at things like diversion tactics, anti-alcohol and substance abuse tactics within the community. And the way I engaged with those young folks is actively figuring out, well, what do they want? They don't want doctors coming into their community and actively, doing like the white coat syndrome thing. They want to an opportunity where their own voice, their own leadership can be heard, can be seen, and create a platform for them to basically share, see, and be seen. And so that's really what I've been all about throughout my entire career. I currently work for William and Mary, but the bulk majority of how I infuse this arts throughout my entire career has really been taken from the approach of some of this design thinking methodology. How do we put the human in the center of what we're trying to look at, sort of analyze, and adjust and sort of grow from? And so what I would say about my company, Beard Collaborative, is we actively are going out into universities, into communities, and we're teaching these skills so that way others can sort of elevate their work, better connect with their communities, and grow.
I love that, and I really enjoy just hearing how it's so innovative, but to be engaging and that people are empowered in these communities. And so you use improv as a tool in the work that you do. You mentioned, working at William and Mary. Can you talk about how you see applied improvisation helping individuals in their career development?
Absolutely. So, what I would say, like at its core, if we think about improvisation and more particularly applied improvisation, because improvisation can be anything, it's literally creating something from nothing on stage in terms of performing arts. But when we take and look at applied improvisation, that is that art form in a non-theatrical setting, it's been shown to basically build confidence, self-confidence for individuals. There was a large cohort study that looked at members of the veterans community and also active service members, and they found that it enhanced their communication skills, it built their empathy, and their ability to adapt to rapid change. And I think those are core fundamental pieces of how individuals can better progress their career. Whether you're an undergraduate student and you're trying to figure out what comes next and how do I take these skills, especially if you're studying the liberal arts, it's how do I apply these techniques, these skills that I'm building and adapt them. I tweak them ever so slightly so that way I can be a more engaging interviewee, a more engaging collaborator and colleague on teams. So a lot of what this work sort of is diving into is really building from the core of what are my skills and how can I outwardly express those skills? How can I make sure I'm communicating them effectively? And that's really where applied improvisation comes into play that role. Design thinking can certainly do that as well as we start to look at like organizational strategy and how a person can then backfill and help support growth and scaling an organization. So there are so many different ways that these pieces can apply, but I think a lot of folks look at improvisation really as, oh, that's risky. Like, I can't do that. I don't have those skills. Like, that's not something that I'm comfortable with. But what I encourage folks is to really just think, this conversation that we're having right now, this is improvisation. Certainly, I have skills that I'm bringing into it and that are connecting from our conversation at a broader level. But the questions that you're asking me, you had to improvise to create them on the front end. It's just how it's happening in the flow. So when folks say like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be very good at that, every conversation we have is improv. There's not a script that we have on life. And that's something that I really encourage folks that I'm doing any kind of career development with, work with, is to really think about there is no like narrative or singular path that I can go down. It is something that's going to flow, it's going to web, it's going to go through different sort of angles. And we have to be able to be comfortable with those sort of adaptations and changes.
Oh, absolutely. I think it can be an intimidating thing, especially when people hear the word improv.
Yeah.
How do you introduce it? Like in thinking about college students, how have you introduced the concept and how have you seen it help your students?
Absolutely. So, the bulk majority of folks that I work with, what I would say is when they first come into, even if it's just like a 1 hour or 3 hour workshop, they come in from the perspective of like, ooh, I don't know if I can do this. Like you see it, everyone's got the deer in the headlights. They're like, I don't want to do any of this. Like I was told by my boss or I was told by my professor that I need to do this thing. And so by the end, we see folks that are really just, I mean, they're blooming. They're totally engaged and they're really connected. And what I would say is lean into the moment. And that's really what I encourage in my workshops is just recognizing that it is a relatively safe space, but I describe it ultimately as a brave space. It's not necessarily safe, it's psychologically safe, but it is something that's, challenging. It is something that's putting you outside of maybe your comfort zone. And what I encourage folks to think is this is an area where if you step outside of your comfort zone a little bit here, it's not like you're going to be falling off a cliff. We all in improv, we talk about this concept. We've got each other's back. We have to have each other's back. And so that idea of like, I've got your back, you've got mine, if we're talking about a student cohort, really thinking about who's your community, who's your tribe, who are you working with day in and day out, and how can you be of better support for each other? How can you really connect with each other on a deeper level? Whether it's something simple like, oh, I'm going to help you with your resume, you're going to help me with mine, or it's, hey, take a peek at my job application, my cover letter, all these sort of different pieces, because we're better together. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of collaboration. I think it's not necessarily something that we should be competing with each other all the time. We all bring unique skill sets. Someone may be a better writer, someone may be a better communicator in terms of verbal, communication. So all these sort of pieces come in and play together, and improv is a great way to help those bloom and blossom.
Yeah, I think you're right on point where it can be something that is out of the comfort zone. And that's something we teach our students. Like in this world, in your professional development, part of your growth is stepping out of your comfort zone. And we're constantly communicating, whether it's a job interview or, like you said, crafting an email or doing an informational interview. And it's all about problem solving. I'm going to ask you, would you mind sharing just like an activity, something that you can describe easily through the
Yeah.
podcast, something that you've used that you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, something that I really love a lot of the components of an actor's warm up. And so, if you're a singer, you may have done something similar, or if you've done any stage acting, you may have done something like this. But when I think about like, what are some of the feelings that you may have when you go into an interview? Like, what are those things? Talk about nervousness, maybe you're fidgety in your energy, you're really worried, your feet may be moving, your hands may be shaking a little bit. And so in those moments, I mean, that is literally a fight or flight response. Your endorphins are running. So how do we start to calm ourselves down? It's really trying to get that parasympathetic nervous system sort of active. We need to get into that state. And so in that process, one of the things that I like to do is a shakedown. Now, this is something that I would encourage folks to do when they're not necessarily in the building where they're about to do this interview. It's something that I would encourage you to do on your way. Maybe you're in your car, you're waiting to go into the building, or you're doing it at home before you leave. And what you're going to do is you're literally just going to take your hands and you're going to shake them back and forth. It's almost like a limp wave. And you're going to do both hands, and then you're also going to do your feet. I want you to be standing for this if you can stand. And I want you to move your feet too and do the same thing. You're going to wave your feet almost like you're waving at someone, but you have your foot up and you're just wiggling it back and forth. And in doing that, I want you to do it through a count of 8. So 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then to your feet, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then you're going to do 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all the way until you're just 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That is going to really explode some of that nervous energy, and it's going to allow it to really get you into a calmer space. Other things that you can do too is you could do vocal warm-ups. So when you think about going into an interview and you're nervous and maybe you're a person that gets tongue-tied, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to do some lip and tongue trills. So that is literally just looking at yourself in the mirror and going, you're just going to blow on your lips. And then the other thing that you can do is you can roll your tongue. Do that a number of times, and it'll start to loosen up some of the muscles in your face and allow you to live more presently in the moment, not feeling like, oh, I'm all tied up. I don't know if I can speak. I don't know if I can be confident. One of the things that I like to teach folks is that you can start at the lowest level, and everything after that moment is an opportunity for growth. It's not that you start at a low level, you don't feel super confident in what you're doing, and then as a result, everything falls apart. Everything I look at challenges as opportunities. Every challenge is an opportunity. I'm a firm believer in that within improv. It's the idea of with each step of the way, we may not necessarily know what we're doing, but as long as we look at it as this is an opportunity where I can add something to this, I can grow, I can do a little bit better, that is where the real magic happens, whether you're in an interview or some kind of public presentation, just knowing that, oh, I might have messed up a little bit. I flubbed my line. That's okay. Pick yourself back up and keep on pushing forward.
Yeah, like being okay with mistakes and failing, but you have some tools and strategies just to keep improving. Uh, I wanted to ask, so like from the standpoint of a facilitator, because like I mentioned before, I borrowed some of your ideas and I've used it again in my career course as well as with my team in
Yeah.
team building. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be honest. When I first thought about doing it, I was nervous because in my head, I'm like, I'm going to fall flat on my face. It's not going to resonate. I'm going to look like a fool. But I'm like, no, this is part of that process. And so I have to practice what I preach. So when advising people that are like, okay, I want to be innovative, I want to be able to engage my students or maybe their team, how would you advise people to approach it? Just kind of what mindset to go into when facilitating improvisation in a
Yeah. I mean,
class or team?
there's a number of really great resources that exist. There are improvisation exercises for the classroom. Second City has a great book on that. Would highly encourage folks to look at that because even though it's designed for basically a K through 12 classroom, it is 100% applicable not only to a K through 12 classroom, but also to a collegiate environment, into a business workforce environment. So there are a number of exercises that exist in there. What I would say from a facilitation standpoint is go through and read the instructions, read what they're advising you to do, but know that like there are going to be moments where you stumble as the facilitator. And the truth is ultimately with all of these improv exercises, there is no clear delineation of right and wrong. What we say in improv is like the only right or wrong is if you're making something unsafe. So as long as you go through those ground rules at the top, someone may not necessarily follow the rules to a T, but as long as we're being safe within the like physically safe, mentally safe within the work that we're doing, it's going to be fine. So I would encourage folks to just step outside their comfort zone and really lean into that if they're going to self-facilitate. The other thing that I would say too is always, always, always do a debrief afterwards. So ask folks like, what did that make them feel? How do they think that that may apply to the work that they do day in and day out? And if you see as a facilitator ways, means to make those connections, to draw those lines and dot it, I would highly encourage you to do that as well. Because sometimes it's like, well, we did this exercise where we mirrored each other. We physically just followed each other and we waved hands and we looked at each other. It was like we had a mirror between us. What does that mean for business, though? I don't understand what that means for business. And the truth is we're actively going through and thinking about body language. What is the story that we're telling through the physical actions that we are making? And what does it say when we mirror someone? Are we going to be more connected? Are we going to be more disjointed? You know, in this podcast, if you're listening, but you can't see, it tells a very different story if I have my eyes or my arms crossed and I'm actively shrugging and hunching, I'm leaning back, versus if I'm actively engaged, I'm sitting upright and I'm trying to connect as much as possible with our audience, with my interviewer. The stories that we tell are very, very important, both physically and verbally.
Yeah. And I think that's what I love about this using improvisation to make other types of connections. I love the mirroring exercise. I haven't tried that one yet. I've done it. Someone has facilitated where I was a participant. But one of the ones that I did in my class that resonated with students was the yes and, like finishing
Yep.
the sentences. And so we were talking about interviews, and we are also talking about career readiness competencies and
Yeah.
teamwork. And so we brought it back together. They're like, well, how does this related? And so I'm like, didn't you have to build upon each other? And that conversation went on longer than I thought because they started to really see the connection.
100%. It's almost like the debrief can act longer than the actual exercise did. So you mentioned yes and I want to talk about that for a minute. So that
Yeah.
is like one of the core components of improvisation. The idea that we state something, I agree to it, and I add something to it. So for example, if I am having a conversation with someone on stage in an improv and I say, "Oh, what a cute dog." And they say, "No, that's not a dog." Well, where do we go from there? That immediately creates a brick wall. Instead, we want to try to invite opportunity. And so by saying yes, and my dog is about to have puppies, would you like one? Now we both have puppies. Like we have so much more to work with. And so I often like to think of folks, especially within the workplace, when you're going through and thinking about that idea is just such a terrible idea. I don't like that idea. I don't want to run with it. typically, like 9 times out of 10, what that idea will be met with is no. And instead, what I like to encourage folks when I do a workshop is to think about being a bad idea detective. And it should be your job to actively go in and try to figure out ways to say yes to that bad idea. The core construct of that idea is probably actually a good idea. This idea is coming from a place that actually is beneficial in some way, shape, or form. And it's up to you to try to understand, well, where are they coming from? What is this idea? What's the root of this idea? And maybe you're agreeing to the root. Like, yes, we are having some challenges with our, shared inbox. People are opening messages, they're not forwarding them, but completely overhauling the system maybe isn't the right idea. Maybe it's going back and incrementally adding things to that process, making more clarity along the way to find solutions that aren't, well, let's just completely start over from scratch, which may have been the initial idea. So my encouragement is don't say no, say yes, and explore more to understand the problem or the challenge better.
I really like that because I feel that that's a great tool to use with team building, brainstorming, ideating, and to not necessarily dismiss something like you said, being a what is it what detective?
A
Bad
bad
idea
idea
detective.
detective. That's what
Detective.
everyone who listens to this episode, I want you to think about that. Like, what are the bad ideas that you've heard in your workplace? Because there's so many. I mean, I can think of a million ideas that I've heard over the course of my career that I'm like, oh, if we do that,
Oh.
that's not going to end well. Like, that's going to be really rough, or it's going to cost a lot of money, or it's going to cause these problems. But ultimately, like where they were coming from was actually a pretty good place. And we
Hmm.
really start to dig in and better understand. And that's where that yes and mindset comes into play.
Yes, I think that's a great one for sure. So a little bit more about, your background and the way that you approach things. I thought it was very interesting, and I'd love to hear more about it. You focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of your work. How does creative storytelling play a role in the communities, as a platform for them to share their voices?
Absolutely. So the program that I did when I was at Virginia Tech is really interesting. We were doing a lot of work within the Appalachian community. And I think one of the best ways to think about it is when someone is having a challenge, let's say they are disadvantaged in some way, shape, or form, it is often very difficult to form a platform where that individual can be heard. Whether it's think about going to a board of supervisors meeting or a local mayor's meeting and trying to actively advocate for yourself. And it is so easy historically for folks to be dismissed or diminished because of their, status, whether that's their disability status, their race, their gender. There are just so many biases that exist. So as a result, in doing some of this work, boosting your confidence to go in and basically buck the system, buck the trends, and also create a really engaging way of connecting with others, it makes it so much harder to be ignored. That's why the arts are such a powerful tool. If you go in and say, okay, I'm going to go not only speak to my board of supervisors, I'm going to go to the local municipal government and share my concerns. I'm going to go talk to the local alderman and share my concerns. What if instead you wrote a poem and you did a spoken word for them? That's going to stick with them. That's going to resonate in a way where it's like, oh, yeah, I heard XYZ complaints. But instead, if someone came to my office or someone came to this public forum and meeting and they did spoken word, like that would be so different. And that would be something that sticks with them longer. And so that's really like, just in my mind, the great hack that exists by infusing creativity with some of the challenges that individuals may face. It is a great opportunity creator that allows for messaging to resonate and stick with people longer.
That's a great idea. I feel that when you do things that are outside the box, you're definitely going to increase your visibility. Uh,
Absolutely.
Such a great tool to have, especially for populations that are looking for that self-advocacy. I think that was really what resonated with me. I work with a lot of clients that struggle with that, is
Yeah.
the self-advocacy in the workplace. Can
Yep.
you maybe elaborate a little more of how people can use this kind of storytelling in as they self-advocate in a professional setting?
Absolutely. I mean, the concepts of radical candor are really running parallel with improvisation. And so, what I would say is by being able to connect more deeply with your colleagues, creating a coalition, creating support for the ideas that you have or the challenges that you may be facing in work, it allows for opportunities for advancement rather than diminishment. And so by that, I really mean going through, and if you are having a challenge, it is so much better to openly talk about it with your supervisor, with your colleagues, make your needs known and clear. I mean, I'm a person with a disability. I have an invisible disability. It's not something that people can see, but I actively advocate for myself. I make sure that my needs are known, and I want to make sure that folks know where my limitations are. And in doing that, that is something that it's really an empathy generator within the workplace. If folks understand, like, oh, this is who this person is, and this is what they need, and this is how I can be a better support. It just humanizes the process. Now, there are always going to be, I'll be blunt, there's going to be jerks in the workforce,
Mm.
people who just do not want to be a human and acknowledge that we're all a little bit different and we all have different needs and we all have different wants and different desires. And in those moments, that's where it's a great point in time to recollect, do a little bit of self-reflection, and determine, is this the right place for me? If it's not the right place for me, what do you need? Like, what needs to change? Because ultimately, in improv, the only thing that we can control is ourself. It's our
Mm.
own reactions to the moment. And so that's what I would encourage in the workforce too, is if you're experiencing something that's challenging, well, what do you have control over? You may not be able to control what your boss thinks or what your boss says. And you certainly can go through the process of speaking to ombud services and HR and things like that. And I would highly encourage you to do so, especially if there's any legality involved. Like if you are actively being discriminated against, speak up for yourself. Absolutely. But there are also toxic work environments. I mean, I read time and time again of organizations, of industries at large that are largely difficult. I mean, I think about financial services, I think about banking, investment banking, and those are hard, grind you and spit you out types of
Mm.
jobs. And so you have to really start to look in and understand, what do I need? What do I want? Is this the right path for me? And if it isn't, knowing and going through and speaking to a career advisor, really understanding, okay, what is my trajectory going to be based on the skills and my goals, that can really start to bring you down a different path. Or you can go back and stay right where you are, and you can persevere and you can live that yes and mentality and help build coalition around that, where you have a team of supporters rather than a team of antagonists.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your personal
Yeah,
story and how it
absolutely.
applies. And for me, the biggest takeaway is knowing and being okay with communicating your needs. That's so powerful.
Yeah.
Communicating your needs.
And at its core, I mean, communicating your needs is really all that improvisation is. We are saying what our, characters' wants and desires are on stage. We're figuring out ways to relate to one another on stage. But at its core, if we aren't doing on stage what is a reflection of real life, it's not interesting. And so
Mm.
that's why improv, in my mind, is such a powerful tool. It is a reflection of the real world that we live in.
Absolutely. Those are some great points. Yeah, absolutely. I love that because you're right. I think that once you do communicate your needs or you are introspective and you recognize what you want, if wherever you're at, it's not serving that, then it's important to recognize, okay, it may be time to make a pivot. Like you said, being able to be understood and accepted too. That's a
Yeah.
that's that's a big takeaway.
100%. 100%.
So this is a very fascinating topic. And, for me as a career coach, as an instructor, I'm slowly trying to integrate some of these strategies in the work that I do. And I know there are other people that are also very interested. What are some resources that you recommend for people to look into? I know you mentioned Second City. Are
Yeah,
there other resources that we should explore?
absolutely. So, I mean, I think at its core, if we talk about applied improvisation, bringing a facilitator in the workplace, that's a no-brainer. It's a great way to use professional development dollars. You can, have a whole team go through a workshop at the same time. I've run workshops for hundreds of individuals within a company, an organization, and then you can also do really small team workshops too. But I think core resources that exist, there are a couple books. There's Yes and, which is by Kelly Leonard, and it's a book that Second City works process through. So basically, their applied improvisation firm. It is a fantastic book, a great introduction to applied improvisation. Another book that I really love is Alan Alda's book, If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face? I love that book so much. It's so funny and it's so endearing. And it's really his dive into when he was doing the Nova production on PBS. He was trying to figure out ways where, yes, I'm the narrator of these documentary series, but how do I actively be a better communicator and a better storyteller in a domain that I have no expertise? So really trying to think about ways that he can ask questions that drive engagement with the individuals, the scientists that they connect with. And that's something that I'm really passionate about as well. Virginia Tech, since my graduation, has gone on to starting a Center for Communicating Science. There are a number of these school departments that are starting to pop up. If your university has one, I would highly encourage you to reach out to them, talk about some of the work that they're doing, because there is, in my mind, very little difference between the skills that it takes to communicate science than the skills that it takes to be a great communicator across the board in any work environment. So definitely those two books are great resources. And then the other thing too, take an improv class. You know, an improv class, what I will say, I'll give you the caveat, an improv class is going to be a little bit more intimidating than applied improvisation workshop may be. And the reason for that is they actively are thinking and looking at you as someone who, yes, may be doing this for fun, but two, is also willing to be an actor on stage. A lot of my applied improvisation work that I do, the workshops that I bring to different companies, organizations, non-governmental organizations, and governmental departments, is really looking at it from the framework of you are first and foremost a project manager, a administrator, a business, advocate, a liaison, whatever it may be. That's the sort of box that I'm putting these folks in. When you enter into a theater and say, okay, I'm going to take an intro to improv course, they're looking at you as someone who wants to get up on stage and do it for fun. I don't want you to think, oh, I could never do that. I can't do that. Most theaters offer an intro 30-minute to 1 hour workshop. Look at doing one of those first. It's a great sort of sampling of what could be. And there are improv theaters all around the globe. Pretty much every major and even mid-sized city at this point has an improv theater that has a dedicated training center that is part of it. So I would highly encourage you to type in your city and then type in improv theater or improv classes, and I can almost guarantee you will find something.
Those are great resources. I'm gonna add that in the show notes, but I also appreciate the distinction because
Uh-huh.
I think
Yep.
that when I've introduced, like, we're gonna do some improv, I think like my students will be like, they think they're gonna do acting, but now you're saying like if you're actually gonna do an improv like introduction through one of those organizations, like you're actually going to be on stage.
That's the big difference. I mean, in my
Yeah.
applied improvisation workshops, I often try to lean into exercises that are group. So we're
Mhm.
not putting one individual in the spotlight. It allows for folks to collectively have a little bit of breath and say, okay, I'm not being put on the spot. Like there is no one who is focusing on just me. And if there is ever an exercise that necessitates something like that, I always take a volunteer and I always make it clear ahead of time, you will be put up on the spot, but I'm here to be a support, here to be an advocate for you in that process. So
Uh,
yeah, I think that's the key. And what I'll say is like not every facilitator has that mindset, but I think it is tremendously important. And that's something that I do with my business is making sure that people are safe in through this process.
think that's important, that safe piece, and that it's a part of
Yep.
a group.
Yes.
That's important to recognize. So, can you share any upcoming projects or services that you offer that you'd like to promote?
Yeah, absolutely. So my business, beardcollaborative.com, we offer a number of different services. I do keynote talks on collaboration and a number of other topics. I also do applied improvisation workshops and design thinking workshops where I'll come to you, or we can even work virtually to sort of go through and look at some of the challenges that maybe your team is facing, maybe that you're facing as a leader, trying to gain buy-in towards maybe strategy shifts that may be happening in the workplace. So those are certain, like that's like my bread and butter for my business. And then also, there are a number of things that I'm doing just as the side Alex, as the actor, where if you're in Chicago, I'd love to see you sometime. I perform regularly at IO Theater, as well as The Annoyance. So there are a number of shows that are happening. I've got a show tonight. Tonight's Friday night. I've got a show. So after our podcast, I'm going to be going over to IO to do a show at 8 o'clock.
That's amazing. Well, thank
Yeah,
you for taking the time out of your busy day. You're like,
of
I'm gonna do this
course.
podcast thing and then I'm gonna get on stage.
I love doing this. So it was so great talking to you, Liz. Appreciate
Yes,
it.
likewise. I know, like I said, when I attended your session, it was the perfect timing for me to be energized and enjoy the rest of the conference. So I highly recommend that people reach out to you if they need a keynote speaker, a facilitator. You are fantastic. And I appreciate you taking time to share your insight and wisdom with my listeners today.
Of course. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.